Yeah, I mean, we should just jump straight into that game, I suppose,
We
shouldn't we?
definitely should.
It's undoubtedly the biggest kind of story of the weekend.
Mm,
It was a complete annihilation. I
yeah.
wrote my newsletter this week on it. That's the way I put it. It was an abrupt and damning indictment on Nuri Sahin's start at Dortmund.
Mm,
He was seething at halftime or full time. Sebastian Kell was on camera. He was seething. Valdemar Anton as well was on camera. He was furious. Um, I suspect that Bochum are going to have a very difficult time against Dortmund on Friday because they'll probably feel like they have to set the record straight. But
mm,
it was a game in which it wasn't as if Stuttgart played some sort of trick or pulled the wool over Dortmund's eyes and fooled them. It was a game in which a very good team beat an average team, in my opinion.
mm,
And it might be hard to say considering the way that Dortmund have started the season with relative comfort. But as I kind of go into quite a lot of detail in my newsletter this week on the Substack, we've kind of had this coming, I think, for Dortmund for a while now. They
mm,
were they were not by any means, sorry, outstanding against Club Borussia, Brugge rather. In fact, I didn't realise this until I went back to check, but the non-penalty XG in that game was lower than Club Brugge's, which goes
mm,
some way to explain it. And as we talked about on the reaction show last week to that Champions League game, it was a game in which Nuri Sahin had to kind of rely on Girassi to come on, Gittins to come on, really shake things up, and it happened to work. And we talked about how we're only 5 or 6 games into the season, and that's the second time that Gittins had to come on and kind of really rescue a stale Dortmund performance.
mm,
And then obviously in the Heidenheim game before that also showed, with all due respect to Heidenheim, not world beaters by any means, but a team that, despite going behind to Dortmund, still managed to find ways to break through that defence. And this was the first time they came up against a very good team, a Stuttgart team who went toe-to-toe with the European champions. The team, by the way, the European champions who obviously dismantled Dortmund in Champions League final just a few months prior to that, obviously. So, it's kind of
mm.
interesting kind of link there. But I did wonder if Stuttgart would be tired after that really impressive, heroic performance in Spain. And they weren't. They felt like they had a point to prove. And I think they felt that they had to prove that they were still, what was probably the second best team in Germany last season.
Mm.
Whether that's because, they've got a bloody nose off Real Madrid and they wanted to set the record straight, whether it's because Dortmund had, somewhat ungentlemanly stolen their best players in the summer transfer window, or simply because it was a big game and they wanted to win it. But Stuttgart really had a point to prove in this game. Undav in particular, Dennis Undav, I thought, characterised that so well, so tenacious, didn't let anyone beat him to any ball, whether it was in the air, whether it was on the ground, whether it was anything really. And it was a game in which, I keep going back to this, but Stuttgart just completely broke down a very average Dortmund team. And I think we've been waiting for a while now for a good team to kind of expose the real problems in this team.
Well, I think it's also interesting with Stuttgart, right? Because they had a difficult start to the season, and I kept on saying, look, this is still a really good team. I think that the issue for them was that they lost a lot of players, and I think too that Dennis Under, for example, came back a little late, and then they had that extra game in the Super Cup, which I think is, everyone who watched it will agree with this as a game that they should have won. And they're slowly but surely getting back to the form that they had last year, right? And I mean, we have to remember too, last year's start wasn't 100% perfect either. I mean, they won the first game 5-0, right? But then they lost the second game 5-1, and it really kind of, they built through the first few matches to get together and get to know Sebastian Hoeneß's system, which isn't always easy to play, right? It is a very different system that we've seen with a lot of German teams play over the years. kind of marries this possession style football with German gegenpressing, but also, uses a lot of the South American football that's coming into Europe slowly but surely, the relationism and all that sort of stuff. It's not an easy system to learn. But, you do get the sense that this is still a really good team, and that the pieces that they brought in, once they were starting to click, they were going to cause some damage. And then you have Dennis Undav, who is just a remarkable player and has really become, I think also made this really big statement about staying, right? There's the fact that a lot of other players like Waldemar Anton, Hiroki Ito, Sergio Guirassy decided to move on, and he made a really big point of staying, and to such an extent, really, that when Brighton wanted to have him back, he said absolutely not, right? And helped this transfer to go through. And he comes and steps up, and a big game like that, I think, is a really big statement. And it's also, and I think I kind of chuckled to myself as I sat on the side of the road, dealing with my own misery, is for VfB Stuttgart, this must be the most satisfying thing in the world, because you had Borussia Dortmund come in and taking two of their key players. And what do Stuttgart do in reaction? They absolutely dismantle Dortmund in every possible way, showing them that, yeah, you can take our players, but unfortunately you don't have anyone in charge who knows how to put them in the right system. So, hey, we'll take the 3 points, and we also at the same time cause you a humiliating defeat while we at it. And I think that was a really strong statement from Stuttgart, from Hoeneß and everyone involved there. And I think they're a team to reckon with this year. And Dortmund is now a team that really has to look at themselves and think, well, maybe we just looked at this the wrong way. Maybe we really looked at this the wrong way when teams like Stuttgart and Leverkusen do us better because they have the right people in charge.
Yeah, I mean, the former Stuttgart players in that Dortmund team were an interesting kind of focal point for, well, the home fans to begin with, and every time Anton touched the ball, he was booed. And to be fair to him, he spoke about this after the game, and he said, look, the fans have deserved their right to make their point about that transfer. Mm-hmm. He's like, I respect it. We move on from it. And I thought that was actually a very grown-up way to look at it, because he did get booed for 90 minutes straight, which, as you expect. But it's interesting because we talked about this in the summer when Stuttgart were losing all these players, and the focus was on Guirassy and whether he can score the goals at Dortmund that he scored at Stuttgart. And we talked about whether his goals last season were because he suddenly just stepped up a gear as a player and developed into this new kind of echelon of strikers. Similarly with Anton, obviously earned himself a call-up to the national team as well off the back of that. And then they both get this move to Dortmund, and we kind of discussed whether that's because they both become much better players, or simply because the system that they were working in at Stuttgart made them better players. And I actually thought this game was quite an interesting moment to kind of focus on that, because I thought Anton was dreadful in this game. I thought Guirassy took his goal well, but for large chunks of the game was completely, useless up front for Dortmund. And then you kind of flip it over to that Stuttgart team where they've got, an exceptional young central defender in Rault, who's 23 years old. Both of their wingers in Leveling and Milo, both 22, 23. Leveling in particular has had a fantastic week. I thought he was outstanding against Real Madrid. I thought he was outstanding in this game. But then even Demirovic, who looks like he's been playing for Stuttgart for 10 seasons, and the way that he just kind of plays off Undav, the way that Undav plays off him, the way that he kind of drifted away from Schlotterbeck to take that headed goal was outstanding. So on the one side, you have a team under a great head coach which has a system that makes every single player in that team better. And on the other side, you have Dortmund under Nuri Sahin, who's still chopping and changing with every passing game. He made changes from this one to the Club Brugge game, made changes from that one. Obviously Sabitzer comes in for, I think, Daniel Malin. Schlotterbeck gets moved to left back. Nemcha comes in, but he has to go off after 25 minutes, I think, because he was injured. It feels the contrast between the two clubs and the two teams right now, I think, couldn't be more obvious, in the sense that, and we talk about this all the time in German football, in the sense that, because it is unfortunately just a fact of life in German football that your best players will routinely be sold. But, we've talked about it with Freiburg, with Christian Streich for years. We talked about it with Heidenheim as well, the way that they've moved on their players, but they've still got head coach in place who knows what he's doing. And we're seeing it at Stuttgart as well, where they can lose quite literally the spine of that team, but they can bring in new guys and they slot into the system. And after, 3 or 4 match days, they look back to being, the second best team in Germany. And unfortunately for Dortmund, I think that's the price of having a very good head coach. And I think that's the difference between having a very good head coach and having a head coach who's maybe still kind of earning his stripes or learning on the job in Nuri Sahin, because it seems clear to me that he's still not entirely sure what his team is. Not only does he change the starting 11, but I would say they even changed the tactics from match day to match day. The first 2 games against Frankfurt and Werder Bremen, it was very defensive, very controlling, and we were under this impression that we were going to get this kind of very possession-heavy team. And then against Heidenheim and against Club Brugge, it's box to box, it's counter-attacking, it's like the old Dortmund we've seen, where it's like, we'll score 1 more goal than you. And then against Stuttgart, it just all completely fell apart. And the only goal they did score was on the counter-attack, which I found quite interesting because, it wasn't even just the defence was the problem here, it was the attack as well, struggled to create chances for the most part. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to just beat up Dortmund while they're down. I don't want to keep going on and on and on about it, but it really was startling performance to watch. I think Dortmund have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I guess, and I think that's an interesting thing about Nuri Sahin and the club where they are at and this point of time, right, is that I do think that in the Bruges game they got away with one. That is the first half. I still recall when the Kobe made that mistake, made that save, and then the rebound went on the underside of the crossbar and then stayed out, right? And then they grinded out this result in the second half. And that is a real vulnerability for them, that when they play against teams that are better than them, and I think Stuttgart is, as a team, probably better than them, that they will capitalize from those mistakes. And that's when those other teams capitalize from these mistakes early, there's just no way coming back at the moment for them. Now, I do think that this Dortmund team, that they have a good team on paper. I think they made all the right decisions on the transfer market. I think that they addressed depth, and we spoke about that as well. And this is one of the things that has rescued them in the matches leading up to this one, right? That they were able to sort of, okay, well, we're in trouble, but it's still 0-0. We're just going to throw on a bunch of other guys and they're going to fix it. The problem with that is, of course, that if there's no system in place to make this work on a consistent basis, then you run into these issues where teams are just going to find you out early. And I think that is something that Nuri Sahin will have to work on. And also I think that is something that the club as a whole needs to be aware of, that this project is going to be a difficult one, and it could be one that could fail. Nuri Sahin might very well fail at Borussia Dortmund. I don't think, and I don't hope that that's the case, because I do think there is a talented manager there. But the one thing that I am worried about, and I kind of alluded to that in the show that we did last week, following the Champions League game, is that in Nuri Sahin, there is still a head coach in charge who experienced that Jurgen Klopp era. The ex is still in the room, while you're dying to date other people, and that can be really difficult. And I think at some point, I think Borussia Dortmund has to make a decision. Either you bring back Jurgen Klopp in some other capacity and just live with the fact that the ex is still living in the house, and you might as well move her back in, or you completely break, and you completely break with that era, and that means shipping everyone out who was part of it. And I think that is a decision that at some point the club will have to make.
Yeah, it's, just listening to you talk there about Nuri Sahin, it just kind of gave me flashbacks to talking about Edin Terzic in his first kind of couple of months in charge. And, unfortunately, this is the kind of story of Dortmund since Klopp left. They've spent a lot of time and they spend a lot of money looking to sign the next best players, but they don't seem to spend a lot of time and money looking to sign the next best head coaches. If you kind of go through the head coaches they've had since Jurgen Klopp, or realistically since Thomas Tuchel, to be fair, because I think he is a top-class head coach. It's a who's who of just bang average head coaches, to be honest with you. It's Peter Bosch, Peter Stoger, Lucien Favre. Obviously, then Eden Terzic has had 2 or 3 stints there. Marco Rosa maybe is the only one on that list, I would say, that could maybe make that step up. Sure, Leipzig fans wouldn't be saying that right now after their draw on Sunday. And then, of course, Nuri Sahin has to kind of prove that he's not just the latest in a long list of appointments that seem to be made without anyone really doing their due diligence at Dortmund. It's as if they just kind of are happy spending the money and the time signing the right players. I mean, not even the right players actually, because they stuff the squad full of average Bundesliga players, but spend so much time and effort scouting these young players that they can make money on, and they're not really interested in putting the proper system in place. So it's almost like they're putting the cart before the horse, where they've maybe got 2 or 3 really exciting young players. They don't have the head coach in place. Whereas at Stuttgart, they've obviously kind of, won the lottery with Sebastian Hoeneß, and he's proving that no matter what happens with that squad, he can still get something working with them. And unless Dortmund do kind of figure that out and stop kind of making these kind of half-arsed appointments with their head coaches. And to be clear, Nuri Sahin still has a long way to go before we can really draw a conclusion to what kind of head coach he is. I'm really talking about the guys that came before him. Then, we might just find Dortmund continuing to go in circles.
Yeah, I think for Dortmund it's back to the drawing board, and for Stuttgart the season really starts now. Very good game against Real Madrid that I think with a little luck they get a point there. And I think they probably drew the right lessons from it, or Sebastian Hoeneß did. And then this outstanding performance. I think Stuttgart is a team that we all have to watch, and maybe they themselves said they just want to finish top 9. We'll look in a few weeks and see if that is still a realistic outcome for them, because they might have to aim a little bit higher than that. But we'll see. We'll see where it goes for VfB Stuttgart and Borussia Dortmund.